All right, so the next thing we need to bear in mind is that there are certain legal documents, also called processes, for which an officer cannot arrest someone. So we need to know the difference between what papers allow us to arrest someone and what papers don't allow someone to be taken into custody. Here's some examples. If you have an arrest warrant, well, then you can take that person into custody. If you have an order for arrest or some kind of a bench warrant where the person may have been held in contempt for not obeying a ruling of the judge, or maybe this person is just acting up in court and the judge issues a bench warrant. For those types of things, the officer can take the person into custody. But there is one paper, and that paper is called a criminal summons. You cannot be arrested for a criminal summons. That document is basically like a subpoena. But, a subpoena is to get witnesses into court, or to get witnesses to bring documents into court. Well, a criminal summons is to get the defendant into court, but without placing that person under arrest. So we cannot arrest a person for a criminal summons. We just serve the paper like a subpoena, and it'll tell them what day, what time, which courtroom they need to be in, and it will also have the nature of the charge on that document. But we cannot arrest. Now we need to know that, because if we arrest someone under a criminal summons, then we have done an illegal arrest. And we put them in the patrol car to take them to the clerk's office for their bond hearing. We've just kidnapped them. So we have to remember, we cannot arrest for a criminal summons. All right, so how we covered this in the last video last week, so I'm just going to briefly go across the top of it now. If we have an arrest warrant, that's the only document we need if we're going to the defendant's residence. That document would allow us, if we have probable cause to believe that the person is inside, we can go inside that residence and search for the defendant, even though all we have is an arrest warrant. However, if we're going to a third party's house, it could be a family member, a friend, as long as the defendant does not live at that house, now we need to have two documents with us. We need an arrest warrant for the defendant, and we need a search warrant for the third party's residence. The search warrant gets us into the house or apartment, and then the arrest warrant allows us to take the defendant into custody. If you want to know more about it or an example of that happening, watch last week's video. What do we do if we place someone under arrest and they have minor children with them? For instance, let's say we have the misfortune of pulling a soccer mom who might be, let's say she's driving while intoxicated and she has the kids in the minivan with her. Well, she's going to jail. What are we going to do with these children? All right, so the first thing that we're going to try to do is to find an adult for which the mother is willing to let the children go with. So we need an approved supervising adult. Now notice, it's coming from the person who has legal custody of the children. So even though she's intoxicated, she can tell us who she wants these children to go with. Now that we can get into a bind sometimes, because what if this lady is divorced and her ex-husband is driving by on the highway and sees this happening? Well, those are his kids too. And he pulls over and says, I'm taking my children. And if this mother says, no, you're not, and she has a document saying she is the custodian, that she has legal custody of the children, that father's not taking those children that day. So what do you need to remember? The person being arrested, if they're the legal caretaker of these minor children, they get to determine who the supervising adult is going to be. It could be their friend, it could be their mother or father. You get the idea. Now what happens if she or he that's in charge of these children will not tell you who they want to take the custody of the children? Or maybe there is no one. I've had that happen before, where a mother had come down from Michigan and the mother was being taken into custody. There were no family members in North Carolina. What do you do then? You contact the Department of Social Services, and they will temporarily take custody of those children. All right, when can an officer use deadly force? There's a whole section in your lesson plan that goes into great detail about when an officer can use deadly force. So the primary reason, and it's the safest reason as far as once the officer gets into court, to defend that his action was appropriate. The primary reason to use deadly force is to defend his or herself as an officer, or to defend a third party, another life. But that's not the only time, and sometimes our society gets upset when the officer uses one of the other reasons. So this is the safest reason. If someone's shooting at the officer, if someone is shooting at other people, and the officer intervenes and uses deadly force, that's the primary reason. But another way that this can happen is for the officer to be able to effect an arrest. The officer is trying to get this person into custody. This person is fighting back, resisting, and in the process of doing so, the person is using a weapon in which to try to escape. Maybe this person has a knife or a gun, and resisting that arrest through the use of a weapon, the officer can use deadly force in that situation. Another possibility is if the officer believes that deadly force is imminent, that something life-threatening is going to be coming towards the officer or a third party. Notice that it hasn't happened yet. The officer is predicting it is about to. Let's think of a situation. You're telling that suspect, maybe this is someone that's just been involved with a bank robbery, and they displayed a weapon during the bank robbery. And now you've got this you were in a foot chase and they're out in the woods, and you're telling this person, show me your hands, show me your hands. And they will not show their hands. They keep their hands in their pocket. And all of a sudden the person makes a quick move, like they're drawing that weapon out of their pocket. If the officer feels like what is about to happen is imminent right now, it's immediate, the officer doesn't have to wait until the suspect shoots at the officer. Does that make sense? So if the officer, and the key is this phrasing right here, if the officer reasonably believes that imminent force was coming, that it's immediate, it's not tomorrow, it's right now, I've got to make this decision in a fraction of a second, then the officer can use deadly force. All right, just like earlier in the lesson plan, I mentioned to you anytime an officer is on trial, especially regarding the use of force, the test that the court is going to use is called the totality of the circumstances test. The court is going to look at all the facts, the big picture, and then determine, is the actions that the officer used, were they reasonable? So that's really all we need to remember. The totality of the circumstances is the test the court uses when a law enforcement officer, an officer's actions is on trial. All right. Going back to these deadly force issues, there's some situations where they're clear cut, and as long as the officer sticks to these guidelines, the officer should be fine. But there's one area, when I see officers mess up, this is going to be that one area. So let's look at it. We had at the department that I worked at, we had a situation like this. If you go back in your lesson plan and you look at those situations where deadly force can be used, there is one situation that says an officer can use deadly force to prevent the escape of a convicted felon. And that's called the fleeing felon rule. It's also called the prison guard rule, because that's really who it's written for. And the key is we need to make sure that we understand this type of deadly force can only be used when the suspect has been convicted, not suspected. This means they've been to trial and found guilty of a felony, and now they're trying to flee. All right, so when I see a law enforcement officer or a student mess up on this, it'll be because the student has been put in a situation where the person has been suspected of committing a felony. Do you hear me? Not convicted, suspected. So maybe this person is broken into a house, it's in the middle of the night, and now the officer drives up and the person comes running out of the house, and the officer knows, oh, they've just committed a felony. And so they shoot the suspect. You can't do that. So please make sure you understand thoroughly the fleeing felon versus the convicted felon. Now, if let's say we're a deputy sheriff and we're in a courtroom as a bailiff, and let's say that it's a murder trial and the defendant has just been found guilty by the jury, and now this suspect is sitting at that defendant table, and they're like, I'm going to prison for the rest of my life. Forget this. And they get up and start trying to run out of the courtroom. Are they a convicted felon at that point? And you want to nod your head this way. Yes, they are. Could the bailiff, I'm not saying should, I'm saying could the bailiff shoot that person as they're trying to exit the courtroom? And the answer is yes. That is the fleeing felon rule. And just like a prison guard can shoot someone that's trying to climb the fence and escape, in that moment that bailiff could shoot the defendant. Now hear me. I'm not saying that the deputy should. I'm saying that he or she could because of the prison guard or the fleeing felon rule. All right. So now let's talk about some Fourth Amendment stuff. Particularly, where and when can officers search? And most of the time, those questions can be answered with one major understanding. If you find yourself on a Fourth Amendment question and you're wondering, does the Fourth Amendment apply here? The first thing I want you to do every time is ask yourself, in this situation, does this person have the right to privacy? Because most of the time, if you say, yes, this person has a right to privacy, then the Fourth Amendment applies. So let's try to make all those words come alive. All right. So your lesson plan talks about open fields. And in open fields, the court has determined that you and I, we have no right to privacy in an open field. And so basically then we need to understand, well, what is an open field? And the best definition that I can give you is that it is anything that is not on a person's curtilage. So now we're begging the question, okay, then what's a curtilage? And the simplest, easiest, best definition I've ever seen is where the court says the curtilage is the upkept area around a home. So this would be the place where the person mows, picks up the trash, trims the hedges. And it can include outbuildings as long as those outbuildings are on the curtilage, that upkept area around the home. Notice there's no predetermined set of feet, away from the house. Is it 50 feet, 100 feet, 1,000 feet? The best answer I can give you is the area immediately surrounding the home that is upkept. And anything beyond that, it starts getting gray. Like for instance, let me show you where it can get confusing. What if the person lives on a farm? It's a 100-acre farm, but maybe they only mow 1 acre of it, but the other 99 acres they bush hog. Is that upkept? And the truth of the matter is, I don't know. It's going to be up to determine if the court is going to deem that to be upkept or not. So I need to throw a golden rule out to you now. When you're in doubt like that and you don't know, get a warrant. Because then you don't have to worry about it. That's my golden rule about anything. If you have time to get a warrant, go get the warrant. Even if you have an exception to the search warrant, if you have time to get the warrant, go get it. That way you can tell a defense attorney, sit down, shut up, I did the right thing. It's all good, right? You've got a piece of paper that let you go and search that residence. All right, but the first place that we're going to declare that we do not have a right to privacy is in open fields. What about abandoned property? And look, property can be real property, like real estate. What if it's an old abandoned crack house and the city or the county has condemned it? They're going to tear it down. The windows are boarded up. But these drug users have broken into the house and they're using it as a drug house? Do you have to go get a search warrant in a situation where that residence has been abandoned by the proper owner? Because it's only the person who really owns that house, that has paperwork saying this is my house, that has a reasonable expectation of privacy. So abandoned real property, that the residents that are inside have no legal expectation of privacy because they don't own it. Now again, that's a gray area. What if they've been living there for months or years? Again, backup plan is when you have time to go get a warrant, just go get the warrant. You don't want for one particular judge to decide, you know what, they've lived there long enough. They have adversely possessed that residence. All right, so don't let that happen. The most common way we deal with abandoned property is with personal property. Maybe you get in a foot chase with someone and they start throwing things out of their pockets. They're giving up ownership rights when they're throwing those things out of their pockets. That's abandoned property, and they no longer have a reasonable expectation of privacy when they throw it away. In a related matter, that means we don't have a right to privacy to our trash, our garbage. When we throw it in the trash can and we roll it out to the street and we expect the trash man to pick it up on that certain day, we've given up our ownership rights once we've rolled that trash off of our curtilage. We still have a privacy interest while the trash is on our curtilage. In other words, the officer does not need to step onto that private property and take that trash. They need to wait until it comes off of the curtilage, and then at that point it becomes abandoned property. So out of those different examples I've given you, and there are others, but the only place in those set of examples that I've given you where we have a reasonable expectation of privacy is on the curtilage. All right, let's talk a moment about the plain view doctrine. That's another situation where we don't need to get a warrant. Plain view, there's really 3 rules, and we covered them in the last video for last week, so I'm not going to go into it in detail here. If you have more questions about it, look at last week's video where I even give you an example. But let's just apply the 3 rules. Rule number 1. Is the officer in a place he or she has a right to be? Rule number 2. Is the officer doing something he or she has a right to do? Rule number 3. Is what the officer is looking at, is it immediately apparent that what they're looking at is evidence of a crime? And if you say yes, yes, and yes, that's plain view. The officer does not need to get a warrant. So where I see officers mess this up, and students also, is they'll be put in a situation where plain view is applying. We're saying yes, yes, and yes, but plain view does not 100% of the time. We can give you some scenarios where we need to stop and actually still go get a warrant. Let me give you one. What if the officer is walking by on a sidewalk, and in walking in front of a house, the officer looks up, and in an upstairs window the officer sees a marijuana plant? So let's go through our steps. Is the officer in a place he has a right to be? Yes, he's on a public sidewalk. And these people have the curtains open. They want the sunshine to hit that marijuana plant so that it can grow. Is the officer doing something he has a right to do? Yes, he can be on foot patrol, community policing, walking through neighborhoods, meeting and greeting people. So far, so good. 3, is what the officer looking at immediately apparent? Man, that's evidence of a crime. Yes, it's a marijuana plant. So we're saying yes, yes, and yes. On those facts alone, the officer does not need to go running, kick the front door down, run in and grab the marijuana plant. No, what the officer needs to do at that point is he or she has enough probable cause to now go to the clerk's office, get the warrant to search the house and come back and properly serve the resident. Take the marijuana plant. All right, so now let me change the facts by one little thing. Same story, but now as the officer's looking up the marijuana plant, the defendant that's inside the house comes walking up to the plant, looks out the window and sees the officer, grabs the plant and takes off running through the house. Now the officer doesn't have time to go get a warrant. Instead, what the officer can do is kick the door down because emergency circumstances, exigency allows the prevention of the destruction of evidence. And from the facts that we're seeing, we're looking at the totality of the circumstances. What the officer is seeing is, uh-oh, bad guy saw me, bad guy grabs plant and runs, bad guy's probably going to destroy the evidence. I've got to stop that from happening. So I hope you see the difference between the two. So make sure you understand the 3 rules. In a place you have the right to be, doing something you have the right to do, and what you're looking at is immediately apparent. It's a crime, but that when you have those 3 things, it does not guarantee you that you can just, without a warrant, go into a residence. Instead, we'll use those 3 things as probable cause to go get a warrant. All right, let's, you tell me, what doctrine would you use here? You get called to a domestic disturbance. When you get there, the boyfriend has fled, but the girlfriend is still there. And while you're interviewing her, you see on the coffee table a white powdery substance that you suspect is cocaine. Are you in a place you have a right to be? Yes, you're answering a domestic violence call. Are you doing something you have a right to do? Yes, that's what law enforcement officers do. They keep the peace. They take reports. They make arrests. Domestic disturbance is within the subject matter jurisdiction of this officer. Is it immediately apparent that what the officer is looking at could be evidence of a crime? Remember, you don't have to be 100% sure. I mean, it could be baby powder laying there, but it doesn't matter. Probable cause says it only has to be more probable than not. All right. So, can the officer seize that white powdery substance? And if you say yes, why? On what grounds can you do it? Is it exigency? Is it consent? Is it plain view? And so make sure, for purposes of the test, you understand what doctrine is at play in a situation like that. I'm not going to tell you the answer. I want you to figure this out. But I gave you some clues in the steps that I took in presenting the scenario to you. Why do you think the officer can seize that cocaine? If it's cocaine, it's got to be tested first. But notice, if the officer wanted to, the officer could make an arrest without knowing It just has to be more probable than not. And I'm asking you, on what grounds can the officer do that? Because the officer's inside that residence without a warrant. All right, so work that one out. So what kind of devices can an officer use to assist in plain view? For instance, it's nighttime and the officer has stopped a car. What device or devices can an officer use to look in that vehicle, approaching that car? And again, if you remember from last week, we talked about anything that's over the counter that you could go into a Walmart perhaps and buy. Those things are allowed. So the officer can use a flashlight to assist his or her viewing by illuminating darkness. That's considered a special device, but it's allowed. So if you and I, here's a test, what about binoculars? Can we walk into Walmart, you and I, and just buy binoculars off the shelf? Yes. So the court does allow that. We can use binoculars to assist us in our plain view. So as long as we're in a place we have a right to be, doing something we have a right to do, and what we see through our binoculars is immediately apparent, that's a crime. Then we can use special devices. Now there's one special device that is readily available to the public. You can go to any Bass Pro Shops and buy it. And it's called a thermal imager. Hunters use it to hunt predators and varmints at night. And what it measures is heat. Well, the court says that's the one toy, if you will, law enforcement cannot use. It was the Supreme Court case, the Kylo case. So the golden rule, the black letter law rule is we can use anything readily available to the public. Except, so there's always exceptions to our black letter law, thermal imagers. Those we cannot use. If we suspect that someone has a, let's say, a grow lab, they're growing marijuana, they have a whole lab in the basement where they're growing this, well, that requires heat lamps. And this thermal imager would show us the heat that's escaping that house. The court says you can't just drive by on the street and point your thermal imager at that house. Instead, what you would have to have is probable cause first that there's a grow lab in that house. Then you could go to the clerk's office and get a search warrant. And when you have the proper piece of paper, you could use a thermal imager to help support your probable cause. Notice that's after the fact, once you already have the warrant in your hand. You cannot use the thermal imager before you have a warrant. I guess the only other nuance would be like a high dollar telescope, something that's very, very expensive. Is it available to the public? Yes. But this thing costs thousands of dollars, and just not every Joe Smith is going to go in and buy one of these things. The court says you can still use a telescope, but only in places where the person didn't have an expectation of privacy to begin with. So let me give you an example. Open fields. So if I'm an officer and I don't want to give my location away, I can stay back several hundred yards and use a high-powered telescope to look into open fields. Or I could fly a drone over open fields because the person didn't have a reasonable expectation of privacy to begin with. However, I cannot use my high-powered telescope to look into someone's house or to fly my drone in front of someone's window. There, the person has a reasonable expectation of privacy. And there I can only use what's readily available to the public, such as binoculars. All right. This one we dealt with last week, and I just want to burn this into your brain. I want to ingrain it inside of you. What if there's an exigency, an emergency that allows you to go into the home? I want you to never forget that once the emergency is over, you have handled that situation. As the officer, you have to then stop and leave that residence, or at least step outside of it. And before you can thoroughly search that residence, you have to get a warrant first. So exigency gets you inside, and you can use plain view while you're inside. But once the emergency is over, your right to be there is over. And so you need to leave, stay out on the street or whatever. If you saw something while you were in there that was evidence of a crime, get a warrant. Come back and serve it. That's probably the most common mistake I see officers make. Don't let that happen to you, either as an officer or as a student taking a test. All right, that's enough for video number 2.